He was 36 and out of work, out of the bunkhouse, and out of the good graces of the only outfit that had ever paid him regular wages. He had no family waiting anywhere, no bank account worth naming, and no plan beyond the next ridge. All he owned was a bedroll, a Winchester, a tin cup his grandfather had carried through 2 wars, and $41 in worn paper and coin. And with those $41, in the town of Bitter Creek, he took up an abandoned line shack in a canyon where every freighter and cowhand within 100 miles swore no man could live through the winter. But what none of those men knew was that beneath the warped plank floor of that shack, buried in the cold clay of the canyon, was something that would change the rest of his life. So settle in with me, pour a cup of whatever's warm, and if you would, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the way this one ends. David Holt was born on a hardscrabble homestead outside of Sheridan in the spring of a year no one bothered to write down, and by the time he was 10, his mother had been dead 4 winters and his father had gone silent as a stone. There were 2 older brothers who left one after the other for the railroad camps and never sent word back, and there was a stepmother for a season who packed up and rode out again when the well went dry. So David grew up on beans, on cold biscuits, on the wind that came down off the Big Horns in October and stayed until May, and he learned young to keep his own counsel and to make what he had last twice as long as it ought to have lasted. He was quiet the way certain boys become quiet when there is no one left to answer them, and he watched everything with the still, careful attention of a creature that has learned there will be no second chances. When he was 14, his father took a horse into a blizzard and did not come back, and the county sent David to live with an old man named Wesley Pred, who ran a small outfit on the far side of the divide and had lost his wife the summer before to a fever that took half the valley. Wesley was near 60 then, a widower with hands like split cottonwood and a way of speaking that used 4 words where other men used 40. He did not treat David like an orphan or a burden or a boy to be pitied. He treated him like a hand, from the first morning on, and he taught him everything a man needs to know to stay alive in country that would rather he didn't. Wesley taught him how to read a sky before a storm, how to set a snare for rabbit and marten, how to skin a deer clean and cure the hide in willow smoke, how to build a fire in wet snow with 1 match, and how to cut and stack firewood so it would still be dry come January. He taught him that a good axe kept sharp is worth more than a bad rifle, and that a man who cannot mend his own boots will not last the season, and that silence, used well, will earn more respect than any loud talk in any bunkhouse from Cheyenne to Miles City. They lived together 9 years in that little cabin above the creek, and in all that time Wesley never once raised his voice at the boy, and the boy never once thought of leaving. When Wesley died in his sleep the winter David turned 23, David buried him under the cottonwood behind the cabin and sat with the grave for 3 days before he saddled up and rode out to look for work. All Wesley left him, aside from 13 years of practical knowledge and the memory of quiet suppers by lamplight, was a battered brass compass in a leather case, the glass hazed with age, the needle still true. Wesley had carried it since the war, and he had put it in David's hand a month before he passed and said only, "Keep it on you, and you will always know which way is home." David had kept it on him every day of the 12 years since, in the inside pocket of his coat, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth against the weather, and he took it out sometimes at night when the fire was low and turned it over in his hand and thought about the old man's face by lantern light. For 12 years after Wesley's death, David worked as a hand for outfits from Montana down to the Powder River country, drifting from spring roundup to fall gather, sleeping in bunkhouses and line shacks and sometimes in the open with only his coat and the stars, and he built a name for himself among ranch bosses as a man who did not shirk, did not drink, and did not talk more than the work required. He was known for his steadiness with horses, for his patience with green calves, for his willingness to take the shifts other men refused, and for the way he could go 3 days on the trail with nothing but jerky and coffee and come back looking as if he had slept in a hotel. He had no wife, no children, no home to speak of, and the only permanent thing in his life was the compass in his pocket and the way he heard Wesley's voice, sometimes, when he had a hard decision to make. By the spring of his 36th year, he was riding for a big outfit east of Bitter Creek called the Rocking H, a spread of some 40,000 acres owned by a man out of Denver named Marlin Reeves, who visited twice a year and knew none of his hands by name. David had worked there 3 seasons running and had come to think, perhaps for the first time since Wesley's cabin, that he might winter in one place long enough to unpack his saddlebag and set his cup on a shelf. He had a bunk near the stove, a peg for his coat, and the respect of the foreman, a plain-spoken man named Ott Renfrew, who had ridden with him on more than one cold morning and knew what he was worth. And it was in that 3rd September, when the aspens were just beginning to turn along the creek and the mornings had the first thin edge of frost, that everything he had built at the Rocking H came apart in the space of a single afternoon. It was not a fight, and it was not an accusation, and that was almost the worst of it. A rider came up from Denver with a folded paper in his coat and a set of instructions from Marlin Reeves, and by the time the sun was over the corral, he had walked through the bunkhouse with Ott Renfrew at his shoulder and read out the names of the 7 hands who were to be let go before the snow. Reeves had sold off 2 sections of the North Range to a mining concern and was cutting his winter crew by half, and the paper did not care who had ridden 3 seasons or who had ridden 3 weeks. It named men in the order the ledger listed them, and David Holt was the 4th name on the list. Ott heard it read and did not lift his eyes from the floor. When the rider was gone, Ott came over to where David was standing by his bunk and said plainly that he had argued for him and lost, and that there was $32 in back pay waiting at the office and a letter of character if David wanted one. David said he would take both. He did not raise his voice, and he did not sit down. He folded his one spare shirt and rolled his bedroll and took his tin cup down from the shelf where he had set it in June, and he wrapped it in a piece of flour sack and put it in the saddlebag with the compass and the Winchester's cleaning rag and the small oiled tin that held his matches. He shook Ott's hand at the corral gate, and Ott said he was sorry, and David said there was nothing to be sorry for. A man rode where the work was, and the work had moved. He drew his $32 at the office from a clerk who did not look up from his ledger, added it to the $9 he already carried, and by 4 in the afternoon he was mounted on a borrowed sorrel that the outfit had agreed to sell him for a fair price against his final wages, and he was riding west out of the Rocking H with everything he owned tied behind the cantle. He did not look back at the bunkhouse. He had learned from Wesley that looking back was a way of asking a place for something it had already told you it would not give, and he did not ask. He crossed the east fork of the creek at a walk, let the horse drink, and pointed its head at the low blue line of the hills that stood between him and the town of Bitter Creek, 40 miles off across sage flats and cut coulees, and he rode into a wind that carried the first true smell of winter in it, dry and metallic and old. The country between the Rocking H and Bitter Creek was open, high, and indifferent, and David crossed it in 3 slow days without meeting more than 4 other riders, none of whom stopped to speak. The first night he made a dry camp in a hollow of sage where the wind broke against a lip of pale rock, and he lit no fire because he did not want the smoke, and he ate jerky and drank water from his canteen, and slept with the Winchester in the crook of his arm and the sorrel picketed close. He woke in the blue hour before dawn to the sound of coyotes running a rabbit somewhere down the draw, and he lay for a while listening and looking at the stars that were still hard and small above him, and he thought about the peg in the bunkhouse where his coat had hung and the way the stove had ticked in the night, and then he put those thoughts aside because they were not going to help him and got up and saddled. By midday of the second day, the sage had thinned and the country had risen into broken ground of red rock and juniper, and he could see the smoke of Bitter Creek smudging the sky 20 miles off, and by evening he was among cottonwoods along a creek whose water ran clear and cold over stones the size of his fist. He watered the horse and washed his face and hands and neck in water that made his skull ache, and he ate the last of the jerky and slept better that night because there was the sound of the creek to fill in around him, On the third day, he came down out of the juniper into the wagon road that ran into town from the north, and he rode the last 8 miles at a walk, taking the measure of the country the way Wesley had taught him, the way the drainages ran, where the pines held the snow, which slopes faced south and would clear first in a thaw, and which cold black canyons cut back into the mountains west of the town and would hold winter longer than anything else in the county. He noticed, in particular, one canyon that opened north-northwest of Bitter Creek like a narrow doorway into darker country, its mouth guarded by 2 shoulders of red stone and its floor already lying in blue shadow, though the sun was still an hour from setting. He did not know it yet by name, but something in him marked it, the way a man marks a face in a crowd that he feels he has seen before. And he rode on into town with that canyon behind his shoulder and the compass warm against his ribs. Bitter Creek was one street of weathered board fronts and a rail siding stacked with hides, a livery, a mercantile with a tin awning bent by some past wind, a saloon, a land and cattle office, and a Wells Fargo shack that looked closed more days than open. David Holt put the sorrel up at the livery for 2 bits a night and took his saddlebag and his Winchester into the mercantile and asked the storekeeper, a heavy man named Owen Marsh with ink on his fingers and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, about work and about shelter for the winter. Owen Marsh looked him over in the way a storekeeper looks at a man to judge whether he pays cash. And then he told David plain that the outfits had all cut their crews for the season, and no man in Bitter Creek was hiring before April. He said there was one thing available if David was fool enough to want it, and he tipped his head toward a paper tacked to the post by the door. The paper had been there long enough for the corners to curl. It offered the abandoned line shack up in Rock Door Canyon for the taking, at $41 for the season's use, paid to the county in lieu of back taxes, no questions and no promises. Owen Marsh said the county had put it up 3 winters running and no man had taken it, because the freighters and the cowhands within 100 miles said no man could live through winter in that canyon, that the wind came down it like it was pouring out of a chimney, and the snow drifted 12 feet deep against the north wall. And the last man to try it had come out in March, missing 3 toes and part of his mind. David Holt asked the storekeeper if Rock Door was the canyon with 2 red shoulders at its mouth. Owen Marsh said it was. David counted out $41 in worn paper and coin onto the counter, and Owen Marsh wrote him a bill of receipt for the county and told him the road north to the canyon left town by the smithy and turned to a trail at the Second Creek crossing. David bought a 50-pound sack of flour, 20 pounds of beans, 10 pounds of salt pork, a tin of coffee, a wedge of yellow soap, a pound of lard, a small keg of kerosene, a spare wick for a lantern, a fresh oiled tin of matches, 3 boxes of 44 cartridges for the Winchester, 6 steel traps of the No. 1 size, a coil of picket rope, and a whetstone. What was left of the sorrel's purchase price and his back pay came to $7 and change, and he put it away in his coat pocket beside the compass and walked out into the fading afternoon. He rode up to Rock Door Canyon the next morning with the loaded pack horse the livery let him have on hire, and he came in through the red stone mouth at midday. The canyon narrowed and opened and narrowed again like a room with alcoves, and the walls rose up on either side dark with lichen and streaked pale where old water had run. Half a mile in, on a bench above the creek, stood the line shack. It was 14 feet by 18, built of squared pine logs gone silver gray with weather, chinked with clay that had cracked and fallen in places you could put your fist through, roofed with split shakes and a foot of sod above them, and set on flat creek stones for a footing. The single window on the south wall held 4 panes, and one was gone, patched with a scrap of oiled paper by some hand years past. The door was heavy plank on iron strap hinges, and it hung true, which surprised him. Inside, the room smelled of dust, cold ash, mice, and the faint green smell of old lichen from the walls. There was a sheet-iron wood stove sitting square on a stone hearth in the middle of the floor, its pipe rusted but still standing, its firebox door hanging by one pin. There was a plank bunk against the east wall with rope lacing broken and rotted, a plank table with one leg wedged with a shim, a three-legged stool, a shelf on the north wall holding 3 tin plates, a battered coffee pot, and a lantern with its chimney cracked but its reservoir sound. The floor was rough plank laid on sleepers of pine, and the boards were dark with the polish of old boots and cupped with age. And in one place near the stove, the boards had sprung slightly, as though something below had lifted them a hair off their sleeper. He stood in the doorway a long time and took the measure of the place, the way Wesley had taught him to take the measure of a horse before he laid a hand on it, and he saw what was broken and what was salvageable, and beneath the wreck of years he saw a shelter that a patient man could hold. He unloaded the pack-horse and stacked his supplies against the west wall under a piece of canvas, set the Winchester on 2 nails driven into a log, hung his coat with the compass in the pocket on a wooden peg by the door, and got to work before dark on the chinking, mixing wet clay from the creek bank with dried creek grass and packing the holes with his bare hands until his fingers were numb. For the first 4 days, David Holt did nothing but make the shack fit to live in. He mended the stove door with a piece of baling wire twisted through the pinhole, ran a stiff wire down the pipe to clear the creosote, cut a length of pine from a windfall 100 yards up the creek and split it fine for kindling, and laid a first small fire that drew clean and warmed the room in an hour. He cut fresh rope from his picket coil and laced the bunk frame in a diamond pattern the way Wesley had shown him, laid pine boughs on it for a mattress, and spread his bedroll on top. He filled the cracked lantern chimney with a paper spill and a careful drop of glue made from boiled hoof shaving he had brought in his kit, and it held. He replaced the missing pane in the south window with a square of oilcloth stretched over a whittled frame and tacked in with square-cut nails he pulled from a rusted keg he found in the lean-to at the back of the shack. It was in the lean-to, dragging that keg out into the light, that he first noticed the loose board. The lean-to floor was the same rough plank as the main room, and one board near the north corner rocked under his boot when he stepped across it. He might have let it go, another thing to fix in its turn, but Wesley had taught him that a thing that moved when it should not move was a thing worth understanding, and so he set the keg down and knelt and put his knife under the edge of the board and lifted. The board came up in his hand in one clean piece, and beneath it, in a hollow cut into the clay between 2 sleepers and lined with flat creek stones, was an oilcloth bundle the size of a loaf of bread. He knelt looking at it for a long minute before he touched it. The oilcloth was black with age and stiff, tied with rawhide, and when he lifted it out it was heavier than it looked. He carried it into the main room and laid it on the plank table by the window where the light was good, and he cut the rawhide with his knife and folded the cloth back. Inside were 3 things. There was a small canvas sack heavy with coin, and when he loosened the drawstring, he saw the dull yellow gleam of double eagles, and he counted them out on the table by the light of the window. 47 of them, and 11 half-eagles, and a soft cotton pouch of dust weighed off in a fold of paper, marked in pencil 11 ounces, which by the reckoning of the day came to something over $1,000 in the sack alone. There was a folded leather wallet holding a plat map of the canyon, hand-drawn in ink, now brown, marking a small placer claim on a bend of the creek half a mile above the shack, and a filing receipt from the county land office dated 11 years before in the name of one Henley Praed. And there was a folded sheet of foolscap, once white and now the color of weak tea, written over in a careful pencil hand. David Holt sat down slowly on the 3-legged stool with the paper in his hands, because he knew the name Praed, and he knew there was only ever one branch of Praeds in that country, and he knew before he read a word that Henley was the elder brother Wesley had spoken of once. In the winter David was 18. On a night the wind came down off the divide, and Wesley had drunk a small glass of whiskey and told him that he had a brother somewhere west who had gone to look for gold and had never come home. David unfolded the paper flat on the table under the lantern he lit against the failing light, and he read it slowly, once through to himself, and then a second time aloud, in the quiet of the room, so that the words would be given a voice. He worked through the next weeks with the letter folded in his coat pocket beside the compass, and the $1,000 in coin buried again beneath the same board where Henley Praed had left it, because a man alone in a canyon in October did not need coin so much as he needed a tight roof and a full woodpile and a stove that would burn through a January night without fail. David Holt cut cordwood every morning from first light until noon, working up the creek along a stand of dead lodgepole a beetlekill had left standing 3 seasons back. Felling with a single-bit axe, he kept edge-shaving sharp with the whetstone at breakfast and again at supper, limbing close, bucking to 20-inch stove lengths, and dragging the rounds down to the shack behind the sorrel on a stone boat he built out of 2 split slabs and a length of chain from the lean-to. He split every round with a maul and steel wedge on a chopping block cut from the largest butt, stacked the split wood in double ricks against the south wall of the shack under an overhang extended with poles and canvas, and by the second week of November he had 4 full cords ranked and drying and a 5th begun, which was more wood than a careful man burned in a bighorn winter. He set his 6 No. 1 traps along the creek and up the 2 side draws for marten and mink, ran the line every 3rd day in a loop of about 4 miles that he timed at 3 hours in good snow and 5 in bad, and he brought back what he took to a small skinning shed he framed against the north wall of the shack out of pole and canvas, where he fleshed and stretched hides on willow hoops as Wesley Praed had taught him, and hung them under the eaves to cure in the cold, dry air. He shot a mule deer at 70 yards on the 2nd Sunday of November, dressed it in the snow with the Winchester leaned against a pine and his hands working by feel in the last light, packed the quarters home on the sorrel through blue dusk, and hung the meat frozen from a pole under the lean-to roof where the ravens could not reach it. He walked up to the bend of the creek, marked on Henley Praed's plat one still afternoon, and found the old placer cut just as the map showed it, a low bench of gravel where the water had once been turned aside by a wing dam of stacked stone now fallen and mossed over, and he saw at a glance that Henley had worked it careful and quit it careful, and that the gravel had been rested 11 winters and would give up more color to a patient man in spring. He filed the knowledge away and walked back down the creek in his own tracks. In the 3rd week of November, the first true blizzard came down the canyon out of the north for 2 days and a night, and David Holt sat it out in the shack with the stove drawing steady and the lantern low, and he mended his gloves with an awl and waxed thread by the light of the fire, and he read Henley Praed's letter once again by lantern and slept warm. He came out of the shack on the 3rd morning into a canyon changed and quiet, the drifts against the north wall already past his waist, the creek narrowed to a black seam between white banks, and the sky washed pale as an old cup. He broke a trail with snowshoes he had bent from green willow and laced with rawhide over the long evenings, and he ran his trapline and found 4 marten and a mink, taken clean by the cold, and he came home at dark with the pelts frozen stiff across the sorrel's withers and a good hunger in him. Word had gone into town by the freighter who carried the last of the mail out of Rock Door in early November that a man was living in the shack and had cut 4 cords by the first snow, and by mid-December 2 riders came up the trail through fresh drifts to see the thing for themselves. One was Ott Renfrew, who had ridden the 60 miles from the Rocking H on his own time with a sack of dried apples and a tin of pipe tobacco tied to his cantle, and who stood in the doorway with snow on his hat and looked at the tight chinking in the ranks of firewood and shook David Holt's hand and said nothing but, "You look well." The other was a lean man of about 50 in a bearskin coat named Josiah Beam, the county sheriff, who had come up chiefly to see whether David Holt was still alive, and secondly to bring word that the county acknowledged his receipt for the shack and considered the taxes paid in full. Josiah Beam took a cup of coffee at the plank table, admired the stove's draw, and said that if the man in the canyon wanted to file on the old placer bend, he had only to come into town in the spring and sign the paper. David Holt said he would. Through January and the black cold of February, David Holt kept to the rhythm of the canyon, and the canyon began to know him. He rose in the blue hour, laid a fire in the stove from banked coals, ground coffee in a tin can with the butt of the axe, ate flapjacks fried in lard with a spoon of molasses from a small stone jug Owen Marsh had thrown in without charge on the day of the buying, and went out to his line. He came in at dark, cleaned the Winchester, dressed the day's catch, wrote a line or two in a pocket ledger he kept of days and weather intake, and slept with the compass on the shelf above his head, and Wesley Praed's brother's letter folded in the tin cup beside it. In the last week of February, a boy on snowshoes came up the canyon with a small canvas sack on his back and a note tucked in his mitten. The boy was Micah Cole, 12 years old, the son of the blacksmith in Bitter Creek, and the sack held 4 loaves of dark bread his mother had baked and sent up with word that if the man in Rock Door wanted a hot dinner, when he next came to town he was welcome at their table. David Holt read the note twice, wrote back on the same sheet with a stub of pencil, gave Micah Cole a marten pelt for his mother and a half-eagle for the boy, and sent him down the trail before the light failed. Micah Cole came back a week later on his own, without being asked, carrying a jar of pickled beets and a wedge of hard cheese, and he sat by the stove for an hour and asked how a man set a marten trap so it took the animal clean, and David Holt showed him with a trap laid open on the plank table and a stick for the trigger, and the boy went home in the last light of afternoon with the knowledge in him. By the middle of March, when the days had lengthened and the ice on the creek had begun to sound different underfoot, 3 or 4 folk from Bitter Creek had reason to know David Holt by name. Owen Marsh at the Mercantile kept a small ledger page for him and set aside coffee and salt against his coming down in April. Josiah Beam, the sheriff, spoke of him at the stove in the Land and Cattle Office as a man who had done what no man in the county had done, and had done it quiet. A woman named Hattie Cole, the blacksmith's wife, 41 years old and mother of Micah, had begun to send bread up the canyon with her boy every 10 days and would not take payment beyond a pelt now and again for the trouble. And Ansel Grieve, an old freighter of 65 who had once said within David Holt's hearing at the livery that no man could winter in Rock Door, had let it be known at the saloon that he had been wrong and did not mind saying so. David Holt in those last weeks of winter did small things that made the shack a place rather than a shelter. He carved a shelf above the stove from a length of split cedar and set the tin cup on it where the firelight would find it in the evenings. He set the compass beside the tin cup, out of his coat pocket for the first time in 12 years, because a man who knew where home was did not need to carry the knowing with him every hour. He unbundled Henley Praed's oilcloth once a week and read the letter aloud in the quiet room, so the words would not go unspoken in the house where they had waited 11 years to be heard. He wrote a short letter of his own to Ott Renfrew and gave it to Micah Cole to carry down, thanking him for the apples and the tobacco and for the handshake at the door. He kept the woodpile ranked and the traps oiled and the sorrel curried, and on the first afternoon of true thaw, when water began to run under the ice at the bend, he walked up to Henley Praed's old placer with a shovel across his shoulder and stood a long while looking at the gravel, not to work it yet, but to say to it that he had come. He worked the placer through April and into May, patient with it as Henley Praed had been patient, cradling gravel 1 shovelful at a time in a rocker he built from creek plank and tin, and by the middle of May he had 8 ounces of coarse gold in a small pouch on the cedar shelf beside the tin cup and the compass and the oilcloth bundle. He filed the claim in Bitter Creek on a Tuesday in the last week of April, Josiah Beam walking with him down the street to the Land and Cattle Office and standing beside him while he signed the paper in the name of David Holt, successor by discovery to the abandoned filing of Henley Praed, and Josiah Beam put his mark on the line for witness with a hand steadier than his years. David Holt sat in the shack one evening late in May with the door propped open on the warm air coming up the canyon and the last light lying along the plank floor in a slow yellow bar, and he looked at the shelf above the stove. The tin cup his grandfather had carried through 2 wars stood at one end. The compass Wesley Praed had put in his hand a month before dying stood beside it. And leaning against the compass was Henley Praed's letter, folded now to a soft square from being opened so many times, and the small canvas sack of what remained of the coin, and the pouch of new gold he had taken from the same water Henley Praed had worked 11 winters before. 2 objects from 2 men he had never fully known, and one from a brother who had loved a brother across a distance neither of them ever crossed, and all of them set on a cedar shelf he had carved with his own knife in the shack no man could winter in. He thought of his mother, dead 4 winters when he was 10. He thought of his father riding into the blizzard. He thought of his 2 older brothers gone to the railroad camps without a word since. He thought of Wesley prayed under the cottonwood behind the little cabin above the creek, and of Wesley's voice on the night of the small glass of whiskey saying he had a brother somewhere west who had gone to look for gold and never come home, and he understood at last that he had been the man who carried the news back to the family. Only the family was gone, and there was only him to hear it, and only him to say it aloud. He thought of Marlon Reeves in Denver who had never known his name, and of the rider with the folded paper, and of Ott Renfrew standing in the doorway in December with snow on his hat saying, "You look well." He thought of the men within 100 miles who had said no man could live through winter in Rock Door, and he did not think of them with anger, because a man who has been warm all winter has no anger left for men who were only wrong. David Holt was 36, and out of work, and out of the bunkhouse, and out of favor. He had no family waiting anywhere, and no bank account worth naming, and he had $41 in worn paper and coin, and he spent it on an abandoned line shack in a canyon where no man could winter. It was the best $41 he ever spent. If this story sat with you the way David Holt sat with that shelf in the last light, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who has been counted out, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And while you are there, ask yourself the question David Holt answered with an axe and a lantern and a patient winter. What place in your own life has everyone told you cannot be lived in, and what might you find beneath its floor if you were the one who stayed?